Trees have always meant a lot to me. In fact, one of my earliest memories was I was 5 years old and we lived in Idaho, and Dad and I were on this mountaintop. He was cutting firewood and I was just goofing off, and all of a sudden I looked up and everywhere that you could see around us was mountains of trees. You know, to a 5-year-old it looked like the whole world. And in that moment, Dad came by and said, "Hey Jason, part of what I do is to care for everything that you see here." And at that moment, I thought two things. I thought, wow, my dad's a god. He controls the whole world. And two, I just was really impressed that people could care for trees and care for land. And so from that point forward, I knew that my life was going to be devoted to caring for trees. And so trees have always made sense to me. Trees have always been intriguing to me. And so I got a degree in forestry. I spent time climbing trees. I've cared for trees. All my professions have dealt with trees. And so not only do I respect their beauty, but I also respect the lessons that they can teach. And so when I have an issue that I face, I go to friends, I go to faith, I go to all the common sources, but I also look at how do trees deal with this situation. And so what I'm going to demonstrate here is how trees deal with loss. And the starting point is something that we're all very familiar with. We know that trees create growth rings, and you can tell how old a tree is by counting those growth rings. So again, something that we learned in elementary school. But what I want to point out here is that tree growth rings are very uneven. And so when you look at a typical tree, you'll see a year of small growth, followed by a year of big growth, maybe another big year of growth, then a year of small growth. And what that indicates is trees are keenly aware of growing conditions. And so when growing conditions exist, trees grow. When poor growing conditions exist, trees grow poorly. But years where the growing conditions are ideal, trees grow. They fully utilize the resources available to them. So this is going to become more important when we look at how trees deal with grief, but just needed to be all at the starting point that you can look at a tree and the tree rings describe how that tree has grown during that particular period. So now we're going to look at how trees deal with loss in a community. So imagine a forest situation where you have trees growing all around each other and then one of those trees is lost. So imagine lying down on the forest floor, looking up at the canopy. So again, you're laying down on the ground, looking up, and what you see is where this tree used to be, there's a gap. So these are the other trees that have been growing around that tree for years. What's unique when you go into a forest and see this demonstrated is when you look up, that gap is really unusual. It's never a perfect circle, it's never a perfect square, because these trees have been growing together for years, sometimes for decades. And so the gap that the tree that was lost left, one, is unique, and two, it influences all the trees around it. So as we just were reminded, when growing conditions exist, trees grow. So once this tree is lost, there's new growing conditions. There's new space, there's new light available in this direction. So what the trees do is grow. So this tree will start growing out in this direction. This tree will do the same thing. It will start growing towards where growing conditions exist. They'll start growing inward. This tree, the same thing, all the way around. What's beautiful about the way the trees react is this tree is this shape because of the lost tree. This tree's structure, this tree's being is exactly the way it is because of the shape of the other tree. And when it grows, it's still influenced by the tree that was lost. And so as this tree continues to grow and move when growing conditions exist, it's still being influenced by the tree that was lost. And so over time, you'll see that these trees continue to grow inward because there's growing conditions that exist. Continue to continue until this canopy closes again in the future. But again, that tree fulfilled a role in the forest. After it's lost, there's no one tree that fulfills that role, but the community of trees all come together, still influenced by the tree that was lost, and begin to fulfill that role that that tree played in the forest. So again, it's a beautiful thing. Even when this canopy eventually closes, the influence of this tree is still there, because this tree is going to be shaped in this portion now. Again, you see the similarity from the time the tree was lost to the time this community closes in and fulfills some of the role of the lost tree. It's all done still under the influence and impacted by the tree that was lost. So that's how trees deal with loss in a community. And now I want to describe a more intimate loss. What happens when two trees growing next to each other for years and one of those trees is lost? What's unique about trees is when they've grown next to each other for years, what you see from a distance, leaf on the summertime, full canopy, it looks like one big tree. And then as you start to walk up to it, you notice that, oh, this is actually two trees growing next to each other, two trees influencing each other. And so once we look a little closer at these trees and look at their branch structure, you'll start to notice that they look like a lot like this. They remain two separate trees, growing side by side, influenced by each other, but still separate individuals. So this tree, again, growing where growing conditions exist. Most of its growth is targeted this way because it's away from the partner tree. Trees don't compete for space. They don't compete for resources in this way. And so you'll notice that they're not overlapping branches. They're not competing for that actual space. So this is really what exists when you see two trees growing side by side, even though they appear as one, two separate trees that just happen to be growing next to each other. So then a loss occurs. And it's always hard for me just to erase that tree, because the impact is obvious. So when a tree is lost, when you've grown next to a tree so much, it's obvious, it's noticeable. You immediately recognize that this tree wouldn't be this way if it wasn't for the other tree. So again, what do trees do when they're faced with this situation? There's new growing conditions in this direction, so trees grow. What's interesting, if we were to look at a cross section of this part of the tree, it would look a lot like this. Prior to the loss of this tree, growing conditions existed on this side, and so that's where the tree grew. Immediately after this tree is lost, the next year the growth rings will start looking like this. You can see the difference. All of a sudden, growing conditions now exist on this side of the tree rather than this side of the tree. So again, the year after this tree is lost, The tree responds because growing conditions exist in this direction, and when growing conditions exist, trees grow, and they grow and grow and grow in that way. That's hard to do, is to grow in a completely new direction, but sometimes what gets overlooked is it's also hard to stop growth where growth was easy, where growth was routine. This tree was very accustomed to finding resources, whether it be light or water, in this direction. It takes a lot of effort to stop direction in that growth too. Not only is this tree being asked to grow in a completely new direction, it's also being asked at the same time to reduce growth where it's comfortable, to reduce growth that becomes routine, to reduce growth that's easy in some sense. So it's a dual threat that this tree faces of growing in a new direction and retracting growth where it's been used to. So that's what's going on in the trunk of the tree. The other thing we'll notice is this tree now becomes a sail in the wind. It's standing there with nothing to stop the wind from coming directly at it. The winds always come from this direction, but when the partner tree was here, the wind would come, deflect up and over the tree. This tree has never experienced the full force of the wind from this direction before, ever. All the wind that this tree got was coming from this side. So when the wind would come from that direction, it would be filtered through the other tree, and this tree would just get a gentle breeze. Now there's a new threat to this tree because it's never faced that before. All of a sudden, an impact that it didn't even know existed because the other tree was fulfilling that role of blocking that wind is evident. And not only is it evident, but it's very harmful. Tree is not built for wind from that direction. Didn't even know it existed. So what does the tree do? It has to grow. Growing conditions exist in this direction, so that's the direction the tree starts to grow. And what you'll notice, again, the tree is still growing in a way influenced by the partner tree. And it tries to grow out more at the bottom, quicker than at the top, again, so it can start to deflect that wind up and over rather than directly at it. So over time, this tree continues to grow, grow, grow. And again, just like in the forest, what's really beautiful is if given enough time, this tree shape will be fairly similar to the canopy that existed when the two trees were together. But it takes time. It takes a year of growth in this direction, another year of growth in this direction, another year of growth in this direction, another year of growth in this direction. But again, that's where the growing conditions exist. So that's why trees continue to grow in that way. One other thing that the tree faces as part of this process is sunlight. Again, we know from elementary school that trees need sunlight to exist. Photosynthesis, they take the sunlight, convert it to sugars. Sunlight is something that, again, when this tree is lost, this part of the tree has never experienced the full force of the sun on that side either. And so something as necessary, something as needed as the sunlight suddenly becomes a problem for that tree. Again, how do trees react to that? They react through growth. And so as they grow this way, they start to create their own shade to shade the bark of that tree. They grow thicker bark and more pigment in the bark on that side of the tree because, again, what used to be filtered sunlight is now the full force of the sun on them. So they have to, again, grow where growing conditions exist in order to regain the balance, not only in the trunk, as we saw, they're putting down more weight, more growth here. Structurally, they have to put more weight and more growth on this side. And in the end, what they end up with is a tree back into balance. Whereas before, it was obvious that the tree was out of balance. After growth, the tree each year begins to regain a little bit of that balance as it continues to grow where growing conditions exist. Still, just like in the forest example, everything that this tree does, its form before the loss, its form a year after the loss, and its form 100 years after the loss, is still influenced by this tree. The growth rings never change. The growth rings are there. And the growth rings just show that I used to grow in this direction. Now I'm growing in this direction. And one more thing that's beautiful about this is, again, if we looked at that growth ring pattern before, it was skewed in this direction. After the loss, it started to skew in this direction. Over time, as a tree reaches that balance, this tree's ability to grow equally in all directions returns. So future growth rings will be much more even all the way around. We're starting to get back into some of that comfortable growth pattern that it experienced before the loss. And now it's equally comfortable and has the resources to grow not only this way, but this way. So that's how trees deal with loss. They deal with loss through growth.